Hey everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to examine one of the most catastrophic decisions in human history, a single choice that condemned an empire that had endured for 6 centuries, a gamble so reckless, so poorly calculated, that it would lead to the deaths of millions and reshape the entire world we live in today. This is the story of how the Ottoman Empire, which had once stretched across 3 continents and ruled over millions of souls, made one fatal mistake that guaranteed its destruction. It wasn't the slow decline of institutions. It wasn't the gradual erosion of military power. It wasn't even the rising tide of nationalism that was tearing at its edges. No, this was a deliberate choice made by desperate men who believed they could reverse centuries of decline with one bold stroke. They were catastrophically wrong. The mistake was entering World War I on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary in late October 1914. That decision, made by a small group of young Turkish nationalists who had seized power just a few years earlier, would prove to be the Ottoman Empire's death sentence. Within 4 years, an empire that had existed since 1299 would be gone, replaced by a patchwork of unstable states that continue to bleed and burn to this day. But to understand why this decision was so disastrous, we need to understand what the Ottoman Empire was at the moment that choice was made. We need to see the world through the eyes of the men who made this fatal gamble, and we need to trace the chain of events that followed, a cascade of military disasters, humanitarian catastrophes, and political collapses that would leave the Middle East traumatized for generations. So settle in, because tonight we're going to witness the moment when the old world died. We're going to see how the ambitions of a few men destroyed an empire and created the conflicts that still plague us today. This is the story of the Ottoman Empire's crucial mistake, the decision that changed everything. The Ottoman Empire in 1914 was a shadow of its former glory, but it was still an empire. It still controlled a vast territory stretching from the Balkans to Yemen, from Libya to the borders of Persia. It still commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. It still ruled over millions of subjects speaking dozens of languages and practicing multiple faiths, and it still dreamed of the greatness it had once possessed. But those dreams were haunted by the reality of 2 centuries of decline. The empire that had once besieged Vienna and struck terror into the hearts of Christian Europe was now known as the sick man of Europe. Its military had suffered humiliating defeats at the hands of Russia, Austria, and even the small Balkan states that had once been its subjects. Its economy was bankrupt, with European banks controlling much of its revenue through the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. Its provinces were restless, with Arab, Armenian, and Kurdish populations increasingly resentful of Turkish rule. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 had promised to reverse this decline. A group of young military officers and intellectuals, inspired by European nationalism and positivist philosophy, had forced Sultan Abdul Hamid II to restore the constitution and modernize the empire. They believed that scientific administration, military reform, and Turkish nationalism could save the state from collapse. But their revolution had unleashed forces they could not control. Bulgaria had declared independence. Austria-Hungary had annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. Crete had united with Greece. And in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, the empire had lost virtually all of its remaining European territories. In just 2 years, the Ottomans had been driven from lands they had held for 5 centuries. The psychological impact was devastating. By 1914, the Ottoman Empire was desperate. Its territory had been reduced by 80% in Europe. Its prestige had been shattered. Its enemies were circling, and its leaders, the triumvirate of Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Jamal Pasha, who now effectively ruled the empire, were consumed by a single obsession. They needed to restore Ottoman power, to prove that the empire could still compete with the great powers of Europe, to show that decline could be reversed. It was this desperation that would lead them to make the worst decision in Ottoman history. The 3 men who would condemn the Ottoman Empire to destruction were in many ways products of the age they lived in. Enver Pasha, the most influential of the trio, was only 33 years old in 1914. He had been one of the heroes of the Young Turk Revolution, a dashing military officer who had helped overthrow the Sultan and who now served as Minister of War. He was intelligent, ambitious, and utterly convinced of his own destiny. Enver was also dangerously deluded. He had married into the Ottoman royal family and saw himself as a great military leader in the tradition of the empire's legendary conquerors. He studied the campaigns of Napoleon and dreamed of creating a vast pan-Turkish empire that would unite all Turkish-speaking peoples from the Balkans to Central Asia. He believed that military action, bold and decisive, could restore Ottoman greatness. Talat Pasha, the interior minister, was the political brain of the triumvirate. He He was a former telegraph operator who had risen through the ranks of the Young Turk movement through sheer intelligence and organizational skill. He was pragmatic where Enver was idealistic, calculating where Enver was impulsive. But he shared Enver's conviction that the empire needed a dramatic victory to reverse its decline. Kemal Pasha, the navy minister, was the third member of the ruling group. He was less influential than his colleagues, but shared their nationalist fervor and their belief that the empire's survival depended on aggressive action. Together, these three men held absolute power in the Ottoman Empire by 1914, with the Sultan reduced to a figurehead and the parliament a rubber stamp for their decisions. When World War I began in July 1914, the Ottoman Empire was officially neutral. The empire had no alliance with any of the great powers and no direct stake in the conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia that had triggered the war. The sensible course would have been to remain neutral, to let the European powers exhaust themselves while the Ottomans rebuilt their strength and reformed their institutions. But Enver Pasha had other ideas. He saw the war as an opportunity, perhaps the last opportunity, to restore Ottoman power. He believed that by choosing the right side in the conflict, the empire could regain the territories it had lost and establish itself once again as a great power. The question was which side to choose. The Entente powers, Britain, France, and Russia, were the empire's traditional enemies. Russia had been expanding at Ottoman expense for 2 centuries, taking territory in the Caucasus and the Balkans and dreaming of capturing Constantinople itself. Britain controlled Egypt, which had been an Ottoman province until just 30 years earlier, and dominated the Persian Gulf. France had ambitions in Syria and Lebanon. From the Ottoman perspective, an Entente victory would likely mean further dismemberment of the empire. Germany, on the other hand, had been cultivating Ottoman friendship for decades. Kaiser Wilhelm II had visited Constantinople and Jerusalem, proclaiming himself a friend of the world's Muslims. German officers had been training the Ottoman army. German engineers had been building railways through Ottoman territory. German banks had been investing in Ottoman infrastructure. And most importantly, Germany had no territorial ambitions in the Ottoman Empire. A German alliance seemed to offer protection without the threat of annexation. Enver was convinced that Germany would win the war quickly. German military successes in the opening months seemed to validate this belief. The German army had swept through Belgium and was advancing on Paris. The Russian army had been defeated at Tannenberg. Based on these early victories, it appeared to Ottoman leaders that the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, would triumph within months. If the Ottomans joined what looked like the winning side now, they could share in the spoils of victory. They could regain Egypt from Britain, reclaim the Caucasus from Russia, and perhaps even expand into Central Asia. It was a seductive vision, and historians generally agree it was completely divorced from reality. Enver and his colleagues, contemporary observers noted, failed to understand the fundamental weakness of the Ottoman Empire's position. The empire's army, while large on paper, was poorly equipped, poorly trained, and poorly led. Its economy was in ruins, incapable of sustaining a major war effort. Its infrastructure was primitive compared to that of the European powers. Its population was war-weary after the disasters of the Balkan Wars, and its subject peoples, particularly the Arabs, who made up a huge portion of the empire, were increasingly disloyal. But Enver, according to contemporary accounts and later historical analysis, saw what he wanted to see. He appears to have believed that Ottoman will and courage could overcome material disadvantages. He convinced himself that German military expertise would transform the Ottoman army into an effective fighting force. He imagined that Muslim populations across the world would rise up against British and French colonial rule, creating a global jihad that would cripple the Entente powers. In early August 1914, Enver secretly approached Germany with an offer of alliance. The German government was initially cautious. They doubted the military value of Ottoman support and worried about antagonizing neutral powers. But as the war developed and it became clear that it would not be won quickly, the Germans reconsidered. An Ottoman alliance would force Russia to fight on a new front in the Caucasus, diverting troops from the battles in Poland and East Prussia. It would threaten British control of Egypt and the Suez Canal, one of the most important strategic waterways in the world. And it would potentially inspire Muslim populations in British, French and Russian territories to rebel against colonial rule. On August 2, 1914, the Ottoman Empire and Germany signed a secret alliance treaty. The empire committed to enter the war on Germany's side if Russia joined the conflict. Within days, Russia had declared war on Germany, triggering the Ottoman obligation. But the Ottoman government hesitated, unwilling to reveal its commitment publicly. The empire remained officially neutral for 3 more months while secretly preparing for war. This period of official neutrality masked frantic military preparations. German military advisors flooded into Constantinople. German officers took command positions in the Ottoman army, and in a move that would prove particularly provocative, two German warships, the Goeben and the Breslau, which were being pursued by British naval forces in the Mediterranean, were given refuge in Ottoman waters and transferred to the Ottoman Navy in a transparent fiction that fooled no one. The final step came in late October 1914. Enver, impatient with the continued delay and worried that Germany might win the war without Ottoman participation, ordered the Ottoman fleet, including the two German warships, to attack Russian ports in the Black Sea. On October 29th, Ottoman ships bombarded Odessa, Sevastopol, and other Russian cities, killing hundreds of civilians and sinking several merchant vessels. It was an act of war, carried out without a declaration, and without the knowledge of most of the Ottoman cabinet. Enver had effectively committed the empire to the conflict through a unilateral military action. Russia declared war on November 2nd, followed by Britain and France on November 5th. By early November 1914, the Ottoman Empire was fully engaged in World War I on the side of the Central Powers. The die was cast. The fatal mistake had been made. What followed would be 4 years of unrelenting catastrophe that would destroy not just the Ottoman Empire, but create wounds in the Middle East that have never healed. Enver Pasha's first major military operation as Ottoman commander revealed the deadly combination of ambition and incompetence that would characterize the empire's war effort. Before the ink was even dry on the declarations of war, Enver was planning an invasion of Russian territory in the Caucasus. His objective was to reclaim provinces that Russia had taken from the Ottomans in the 19th century, and to open a path to the Turkish-speaking populations of Central Asia. It was a plan born of fantasy rather than strategic reality. The Caucasus in winter was one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. The mountains rose to heights of over 10,000 feet, covered in snow from October to May. The temperatures regularly dropped below zero. The roads, such as they were, became impassable in winter conditions. And the Russian forces in the region, while not large, were professional soldiers who knew the terrain and were properly equipped for winter warfare. Enver's army, by contrast, was a hastily assembled force of conscripts, many of whom came from the warm lowlands of Anatolia and had never seen snow. They were inadequately clothed for winter conditions, with many soldiers lacking even basic cold weather gear like winter coats and boots. Their supply lines were primitive, dependent on pack animals struggling through mountain passes, and their commander had no experience of winter warfare and no understanding of the challenges he would face. But Enver was undeterred by such practical concerns. He saw himself as a new Suleiman the Magnificent, destined to restore Ottoman glory through bold military action. He planned to lead the army personally, taking direct command of the Third Army and driving deep into Russian territory before the Russians could react. The campaign began in December 1914 with Enver personally commanding an army of approximately 90,000 men. The plan was to advance through the mountains, surprise the Russian forces at Sarikamish, and then drive north into the heart of Russian territory. It was Napoleon's invasion of Russia in miniature, with all the same fatal flaws and none of the military genius. The reality of the campaign was horror from the very beginning. The Ottoman soldiers, many of them peasants from warm climates, were completely unprepared for the brutal cold of the Caucasian winter. Men froze to death by the hundreds, even before contact with the enemy. Frostbite claimed thousands more, leaving them unable to hold their weapons or even walk. The supply columns, struggling through mountain passes in blizzard conditions, fell further and further behind the advancing troops. Enver drove his men forward with ruthless determination, ignoring the mounting casualties and the increasingly desperate reports from his subordinate commanders. He was convinced that speed and surprise would overcome all obstacles, that his soldiers' Islamic faith would sustain them through any hardship, that destiny itself was on his side. The Battle of Sarikamish began on December 29, 1914. The Ottoman forces, exhausted from their march through the mountains and already severely weakened by cold and hunger, attacked Russian positions. The Russians, well supplied and properly equipped for winter warfare, repelled the attacks with devastating effectiveness. Ottoman soldiers, many of them already suffering from frostbite and hypothermia, were cut down by Russian machine guns and artillery. The battle raged for days in conditions of unimaginable horror. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees. Blizzards made visibility almost zero. Wounded men froze to death within minutes of falling. Entire units simply vanished, lost in the snow-covered mountains, their bodies not discovered until the spring thaw months later. By January 5, 1915, the battle was clearly lost. The Ottoman forces were in full retreat, struggling back through the same mountain passes they had crossed just weeks earlier. But retreat in winter conditions was almost as deadly as the battle itself. Men died by the thousands from cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Entire regiments disintegrated as soldiers abandoned their weapons and equipment in a desperate struggle to survive. The final casualties of the Sarikamish campaign were staggering. The Ottoman Third Army, which had started with approximately 90,000 to 100,000 men, was reduced to perhaps 12,000 to 18,000 effective combat troops by mid-January. Scholarly estimates place total Ottoman casualties, including those killed in combat, frozen to death, died from disease, wounded or captured, at between 60,000 and 90,000 men. Contemporary sources suggest approximately 25,000 soldiers died from exposure even before the main battle began, and another 30,000 frozen bodies were found by Russian forces after the fighting ended. The remaining casualties came from combat losses, disease in the following weeks, and prisoners of war. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The Sarikamish disaster destroyed one of the Ottoman Empire's best armies. The Third Army had been among the most effective units in the Ottoman military, made up of experienced soldiers and competent officers. Its destruction left the eastern provinces virtually defenseless and opened the way for Russian advances deep into Ottoman territory. The psychological impact was equally devastating. The Ottoman government had promised that joining the war would restore the empire's fortunes. Instead, the very first major campaign had ended in catastrophic defeat. Morale throughout the army and the general population plummeted. The sense that the war was a terrible mistake began to spread. Enver, however, refused to accept responsibility for the disaster. Instead, he blamed the defeat on treachery, claiming that the empire's Armenian population had sabotaged the campaign by providing intelligence to the Russians and by refusing to support the Ottoman war effort. It was a lie that would have terrible consequences. The truth was that Armenian soldiers had fought and died alongside their Turkish comrades at Sarikamish. Armenian civilians had suffered just as much as anyone else from the disruptions caused by the war, and the defeat had been caused entirely by Enver's incompetent leadership and unrealistic planning. But Enver needed a scapegoat to deflect blame from himself, and the Armenian population of the eastern provinces was a convenient target. The disaster at Sarikamish set the pattern for the Ottoman war effort. Ambitious plans conceived with no understanding of reality, military operations launched with inadequate preparation and resources, catastrophic defeats blamed on internal enemies rather than on the incompetence of the leadership. It was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the war, leading to one disaster after another, and the worst was yet to come. The lie that Enver told about Armenian treachery at Sarikamish would provide the justification for one of the great crimes of the 20th century. Within months, the Ottoman government would embark on a systematic campaign to destroy the Armenian population of the empire. What began as a military disaster would lead to genocide. The Armenian genocide that began in April 1915 was a direct consequence of the Ottoman decision to enter World War I and the catastrophic defeat at Sarikamish. The Young Turk leadership, unable to accept that their own incompetence had caused the military disasters, convinced themselves that the empire's Armenian population was engaged in a treasonous conspiracy with Russia. The Armenians of the Ottoman Empire had been living in Anatolia for thousands of years, long before the Turks had arrived from Central Asia in the 11th century. They were an ancient Christian people who had maintained their distinct identity and faith through centuries of Muslim rule. By 1914, there were approximately 2 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, concentrated in the eastern provinces, but with significant populations in Constantinople and other major cities. The Armenian community had been relatively prosperous and educated compared to the general Ottoman population. They were merchants, craftsmen, professionals, and farmers. Many had embraced the modernizing reforms of the 19th century, establishing schools and newspapers and sending their children to European universities. Some Armenian intellectuals had been active in the Young Turk movement, believing that Ottoman constitutional reform would bring greater rights and opportunities to all the empire's peoples. But the Young Turk leadership, particularly after the disasters of the Balkan Wars and the Sarikamish campaign, had become convinced that the empire's non-Turkish populations were a threat to national survival. They had adopted an increasingly narrow vision of Turkish nationalism that left no room for ethnic or religious minorities. The Armenians, as Christians living in a strategic border region, became the target of their paranoia and their rage. The genocide began on April 24, 1915, when Ottoman authorities arrested and eventually murdered hundreds of Armenian intellectuals and community leaders in Constantinople. It was a deliberate strategy to decapitate Armenian society, to eliminate anyone who might organize resistance to what was about to come. What followed was systematic mass murder on a scale that shocked even the jaded diplomats and journalists of the early 20th century. The Ottoman government ordered the deportation of Armenians from the eastern provinces to the deserts of Syria and Mesopotamia. But deportation was simply a euphemism for death marches designed to kill through starvation, thirst, exposure, and outright murder. Armenian men were typically separated from their families and executed immediately. The women, children, and elderly were then forced to march hundreds of miles through mountains and deserts with little food or water. Ottoman soldiers and Kurdish irregulars attacked the columns repeatedly, killing, raping, and robbing the deportees. Those who survived the marches often arrived at concentration camps in the Syrian desert, only to die of starvation and disease. The methods of killing were systematic and varied. Mass shootings, burnings, drowning, poisoning, death marches, starvation in concentration camps. The Ottoman government used every tool at its disposal to destroy the Armenian population. Local governors and military commanders who showed reluctance to carry out the orders were replaced with more compliant officials. Special units were created specifically to carry out the massacres. The scale of the genocide was staggering. Scholarly estimates of the Armenian death toll vary, with most historians placing the figure between 800,000 and 1.5 million deaths between 1915 and 1923. This represents approximately two-thirds of the pre-war Armenian population living in the Ottoman Empire. An entire civilization that had existed for 3,000 years was nearly wiped out. Villages that had existed since ancient times were emptied and their inhabitants murdered. Churches that had stood for a millennium were destroyed or converted to other uses. An entire cultural and historical legacy was erased. The genocide was not just a moral catastrophe, though it was certainly that. It was also a strategic disaster for the Ottoman Empire. The Armenians had been among the most educated and economically productive members of Ottoman society. They had been merchants who facilitated trade, craftsmen who produced goods, professionals who provided services. Their destruction weakened the empire's economy at the very moment when all its resources were needed for the war effort. The genocide also damaged the Ottoman Empire's international reputation irreparably. Reports of the massacres reached the outside world despite Ottoman attempts at censorship. American missionaries and diplomats in the empire sent detailed accounts of the atrocities to Washington. European journalists documented the death marches and the concentration camps. The Ottoman government's denials and obfuscations convinced no one. The impact on Ottoman relations with its allies was particularly significant. Germany, the empire's main ally, was deeply embarrassed by the genocide. German officers and diplomats in the empire sent reports documenting the massacres, and the German government faced increasing pressure to distance itself from its Ottoman ally. While Germany never broke the alliance, the genocide made that alliance increasingly unpopular in Germany and internationally. The genocide also undermined Ottoman legitimacy in the eyes of other subject peoples, particularly the Arabs. If the Ottoman government was willing to destroy the Armenian population based on accusations of disloyalty, what would stop them from doing the same to Arabs or other groups who showed signs of dissatisfaction? The genocide created a climate of fear and mistrust that made it impossible for the empire to maintain the loyalty of its diverse populations. Perhaps most importantly, the Armenian genocide revealed the moral bankruptcy of the Young Turk leadership. These men, who had come to power promising to modernize and revitalize the empire, had instead presided over its worst crime. They had transformed a multi-ethnic empire that had generally practiced religious tolerance into a state that practiced ethnic cleansing and genocide. In destroying the Armenians, they had destroyed any claim to moral authority. The genocide also exposed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Young Turk project. They wanted to create a modern nation-state based on Turkish nationalism, but they were trying to do so within the framework of a multi-ethnic empire. The result was not modernization but barbarism, not national renewal but genocide. The Armenian genocide stands as one of the great crimes of the 20th century, a deliberate attempt to destroy an entire people, simply because of their ethnicity and religion. It was a crime made possible by the Ottoman decision to enter World War I, a crime that emerged directly from the military disasters that followed that decision, and a crime that further weakened the empire and guaranteed its eventual destruction. While the Armenian genocide was unfolding in the eastern provinces, another drama was playing out on the shores of the Dardanelles. The Allied attempt to force the Straits and capture Constantinople in 1915 would become one of the most famous campaigns of World War I, and for the Ottomans, it would represent both their greatest victory and a portent of their ultimate defeat. The Gallipoli campaign, as it came to be known, was conceived by Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty in the British government. Churchill believed that the Western Front in France had become a bloody stalemate that could not be broken by direct assault. He proposed instead a bold stroke against the Ottoman Empire, a combined naval and land assault through the Dardanelles that would capture Constantinople, knock the Ottomans out of the war, and open a supply route to Russia through the Black Sea. The plan was audacious and potentially war-winning if it succeeded. The fall of Constantinople would not only eliminate the Ottoman threat but might also bring neutral Balkan states like Bulgaria and Greece into the war on the Allied side. It would allow the Allies to supply Russia more easily, potentially preventing the collapse of the Russian war effort, and it would free up Allied forces to return to the Western Front. The campaign began in February 1915 with a purely naval attempt to force the Dardanelles. British and French warships bombarded the Ottoman forts guarding the straits and attempted to sweep the minefields that blocked the passage, but the naval assault failed disastrously. Several ships were sunk by Ottoman mines and shore batteries, and the Allies were forced to recognize that the straits could not be forced by naval power alone. The decision was then made to launch a land invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula, the narrow strip of land on the European side of the Dardanelles. If Allied forces could capture the peninsula, they could silence the Ottoman guns and open the straits to the fleet. On April 25, 1915, British, French, Australian and New Zealand forces landed on several beaches along the peninsula. The Ottoman forces defending Gallipoli were commanded by a German general, Otto Liman von Sanders, but the tactical commander at the most critical sector was a young Ottoman lieutenant colonel named Mustafa Kemal. It was Kemal's actions in the first hours of the landing that prevented the invasion from succeeding. When the Allied forces landed at what would become known as Anzac Cove, they quickly moved inland, threatening to cut off the Ottoman defences. Mustafa Kemal, commanding a reserve regiment, made a split-second decision to attack the advancing Allies without waiting for orders. He led his men forward personally, halting the Allied advance just as it seemed on the verge of breaking through. Kemal's intervention was decisive. The Allied forces, expecting only light resistance, were shocked to encounter heavy and determined opposition. The momentum of their advance was broken, and they were pinned down on the beaches and the heights immediately behind them. What was supposed to be a quick advance to capture the high ground turned into a bloody stalemate. The campaign that followed was 8 months of trench warfare in conditions that were horrific, even by World War I standards. The Gallipoli Peninsula in summer was brutally hot, with temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees. Water was scarce, disease was rampant, flies swarmed over the dead bodies that lay between the trenches, spreading dysentery and typhoid. The smell of death was omnipresent. For the Ottoman soldiers defending the peninsula, conditions were even worse than for the Allied invaders. They were poorly supplied, poorly equipped, and faced an enemy with superior artillery and naval gunfire support. Yet they fought with desperate courage, knowing that the survival of their capital and their empire depended on holding the peninsula. The casualties on both sides were staggering. Based on historical records, the Ottoman forces suffered approximately 250,000 to 200,000 total casualties during the 8-month campaign, with around 87,000 killed. The Allied forces endured similarly devastating losses, with estimates suggesting approximately 140,000 casualties in total, including over 44,000 deaths. Among the Allied dead were roughly 8,700 Australians, 2,700 New Zealanders, 21,000 British, and 10,000 French soldiers. But numbers tell only part of the story. The psychological impact of Gallipoli was profound for all the nations involved. For Australia and New Zealand, the campaign became a founding myth, the moment when these young nations proved their courage and earned their place among the great powers. For Britain, it was a humiliating defeat that destroyed Churchill's political career for a generation. For the Ottoman Empire, Gallipoli was both a tremendous victory and a Pyrrhic one. They had defeated a major Allied invasion, proving that the empire could still fight effectively when properly led. Mustafa Kemal emerged from the campaign as a national hero, the defender of Constantinople. The victory boosted morale throughout the empire and temporarily silenced those who questioned the wisdom of entering the war. But the cost of victory was enormous. The Ottoman army had suffered casualties it could not afford to replace. The cream of its manpower had been killed or wounded defending a relatively small peninsula. The empire's limited resources had been consumed in the 8-month campaign, and while the Allies had been defeated at Gallipoli, they remained in the war, with vast resources and populations that the Ottomans could not hope to match. More importantly, Gallipoli was fundamentally a defensive victory. The Ottomans had successfully defended their territory, but they had not regained anything they had lost. The empire's fundamental weaknesses remained unchanged. Its economy was still in ruins. Its population was still war-weary. Its subject peoples were still increasingly disloyal, and its enemies were still determined to destroy it. The Allied evacuation from Gallipoli in January 1916 was brilliantly executed, with minimal casualties. The Ottoman forces, exhausted by months of fighting, were unable to interfere effectively. As the last Allied soldiers sailed away from the peninsula, the Ottomans could claim victory. But it was the kind of victory that presaged defeat. They had held Gallipoli, but the cost had been so high that the empire was weaker, not stronger, for having won. Mustafa Kemal understood this better than most. He had seen firsthand the courage of the Ottoman soldier and the incompetence of the Ottoman High Command. He had observed Enver Pasha's mismanagement of the war effort and the Young Turk leadership's inability to mobilize the empire's resources effectively. The seeds of his later rebellion against that leadership were planted on the blood-soaked slopes of Gallipoli. The campaign also revealed a fundamental strategic problem for the Ottoman Empire. Even when Ottoman forces fought well and defeated Allied attacks, they could not translate defensive victories into strategic gains. The empire lacked the resources, the logistics and the leadership to go on the offensive. It could hold its existing territories, at terrible cost, but it could not regain what it had lost or strike decisive blows against its enemies. Gallipoli was the high point of the Ottoman war effort. From here there would be no more victories, only a slow, grinding descent into defeat and dissolution. The empire had exhausted itself defending Constantinople. It had nothing left for the battles to come. While the Ottomans were bleeding themselves white at Gallipoli, another catastrophe was developing in the empire's Arab provinces. The Arab Revolt that began in 1916 was perhaps the most devastating blow to Ottoman legitimacy, and one of the most direct consequences of the decision to enter World War I. The Arab provinces had been part of the Ottoman Empire for 4 centuries. Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula had all been conquered by Ottoman forces in the 16th century, and they had generally remained loyal to Istanbul through the centuries that followed. The Arab population had provided soldiers for Ottoman armies, taxes for Ottoman coffers, and cultural enrichment for Ottoman civilization. But the relationship between the Ottoman government and its Arab subjects had always been complex. The Ottomans were Turkish-speaking Sunni Muslims ruling over Arabic-speaking populations that included Sunnis, Shias, Christians, and other religious groups. The Ottoman system had traditionally been flexible and relatively tolerant, allowing local autonomy as long as taxes were paid and order was maintained. The Young Turk regime, however, had abandoned this traditional flexibility in favor of a narrow Turkish nationalism. The Young Turks wanted to create a modern nation-state, and in their vision, that meant imposing Turkish language and culture throughout the empire. Arabic language schools and newspapers were closed. Arab officials were replaced with Turks. The empire's Arab subjects, who had previously been fellow Muslims in a multi-ethnic state, were now treated as second-class subjects in what was increasingly a Turkish national state. This policy of Turkification was deeply resented in the Arab provinces. Arab intellectuals and military officers who had previously been loyal Ottomans began to dream of Arab independence. Secret societies dedicated to Arab nationalism began to form in Damascus, Baghdad, and other major cities. The ground was being prepared for revolt. The Ottoman decision to enter World War I on the side of Germany accelerated these developments. The war brought conscription, requisitioning of food and animals, and economic hardship to the Arab provinces. Arab soldiers were sent to die in Gallipoli and the Caucasus, fighting battles that had nothing to do with Arab interests. The population's loyalty to the Ottoman government, never very strong under the Young Turks, began to evaporate. The British, fighting the Ottomans in Egypt and Mesopotamia, quickly recognized the potential of Arab dissatisfaction. If the Arab provinces could be encouraged to revolt against Ottoman rule, it would open up new fronts and divert Ottoman forces from other theatres. British officials in Egypt began making contact with Arab leaders, offering support for independence in exchange for military cooperation against the Ottomans. The key figure in these negotiations was Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, the guardian of Islam's holiest city. Hussein was an Arab nobleman who had been appointed by the Ottoman government to oversee Mecca and the surrounding Hijaz region. He was a traditional Islamic leader, not a modernizing nationalist, but he resented the Young Turk regime's secularism and its disrespect for Islamic traditions. More importantly, Hussein was ambitious for his family. He had several sons, including Abdullah and Faisal, who would go on to become kings after the war. He saw the war as an opportunity to transform his religious position into a political one, to become not just the guardian of Mecca, but the ruler of an independent Arab state. Through a series of letters exchanged in 1915 and early 1916, Hussein and Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, negotiated the terms of an Arab revolt. The British promised to support Arab independence in the Ottoman Empire's Arab provinces, with the exception of certain areas where British interests were paramount. In return, Hussein agreed to launch a revolt against Ottoman rule. The Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, as these letters are known, would prove to be one of the most controversial documents of the 20th century. The promises made were vague and contradictory, subject to wildly different interpretations. The British would later claim they had promised only limited independence in certain areas. The Arabs would claim they had been promised independence for all Arab lands. This fundamental disagreement would poison Anglo-Arab relations for generations. But in June 1916, none of these future complications were apparent. Hussein proclaimed the Arab Revolt, and his sons led Arab forces in attacks on Ottoman positions in the Hijaz. The revolt began with the seizure of Mecca and the port of Jeddah. Ottoman garrisons in these cities were overwhelmed by Arab forces, and the Sharif's flag was raised over Islam's holiest places. The psychological impact of the revolt was devastating for the Ottoman Empire. The Sharif of Mecca, one of the empire's most important Islamic dignitaries, had rebelled against the Sultan, who claimed to be the protector of Islam and the Caliph of all Muslims. The revolt seemed to prove that the Ottoman claim to Islamic leadership was hollow, that even the Guardian of Mecca did not accept Ottoman authority. The revolt also created a serious military problem. Ottoman forces in Arabia were cut off from their supplies and reinforcements. The Hejaz Railway, which had been built to connect Damascus with Mecca, and which was vital for Ottoman logistics in Arabia, came under constant attack from Arab irregular forces. Ottoman garrisons in Medina and other cities found themselves besieged, consuming supplies that were desperately needed elsewhere. The British quickly moved to support the revolt. They provided gold to pay tribal forces, weapons to arm them, and, most famously, advisors to help organize and lead the Arab armies. Among these advisors was a young British officer named T.E. Lawrence, who would become famous as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence was an archaeologist and intelligence officer who spoke Arabic and understood Arab culture. He quickly established a close relationship with Faisal, one of Hussein's sons, and became one of the key architects of the revolt's military strategy. Lawrence understood that the Arabs could not defeat the Ottoman army in conventional battles. Instead, he advocated a guerrilla campaign focused on disrupting Ottoman logistics and tying down Ottoman forces. The Arab irregular forces, mostly Bedouin tribesmen paid in British gold, proved highly effective at this kind of warfare. They attacked Ottoman supply columns, blew up sections of the Hejaz Railway, and raided isolated garrisons. The Ottomans were forced to devote thousands of troops to defending their lines of communication in Arabia, troops that were desperately needed on other fronts. The revolt also had a propaganda value that far exceeded its military significance. The image of Arabs rising up against their Ottoman overlords, guided by a romantic British adventurer, captured the imagination of the Western public. Lawrence's dispatches and later his book 7 Pillars of Wisdom created a romantic narrative of the revolt that obscured its more complex realities. The reality was that the Arab Revolt was never a unified national movement. It was a collection of tribal forces, motivated as much by British gold and traditional rivalries as by nationalism. Most Arabs remained loyal to the Ottoman Empire, or at least neutral. The revolt was largely confined to the Arabian Peninsula, with limited impact in Syria, Iraq, or Palestine. But the revolt's limited scope did not diminish its strategic impact. The Ottoman Empire had entered the war partly to demonstrate its Islamic credentials, to prove that it was the rightful leader of the Muslim world. The Arab Revolt, led by the Guardian of Mecca himself, shattered that claim. It exposed the Young Turks' Turkish nationalism as incompatible with the empire's Islamic identity. It revealed that the empire's Arab subjects did not accept Ottoman rule as legitimate. For Enver Pasha and the Young Turk leadership, the Arab Revolt was both a military and ideological disaster. They had gambled that entering the war would restore Ottoman prestige and unite the empire's Muslim populations in a great jihad against the Christian powers. Instead, the most important Arab leader in the empire had rebelled, and thousands of Arab soldiers who should have been fighting for the empire were fighting against it. The Ottoman government responded to the revolt with characteristic brutality. Arab nationalists throughout the empire were arrested, tortured, and executed. Kemal Pasha, who commanded Ottoman forces in Syria, hanged dozens of Arab intellectuals and officers in Damascus and Beirut, creating martyrs for the Arab nationalist cause. These executions, intended to intimidate the Arab population into loyalty, instead convinced many Arabs that they could expect nothing but oppression from the Ottoman government. The Arab Revolt continued throughout the remainder of the war, gradually expanding in scope and ambition. By 1918, Arab forces, supported by British regular troops, would capture Damascus and establish a short-lived Arab kingdom in Syria. But that kingdom would last only 2 years before being crushed by French forces, revealing the hollowness of British promises of Arab independence. The revolt's ultimate legacy was not Arab independence but the destruction of any possibility of that independence. The revolt had weakened the Ottoman Empire, but it had also brought British and French forces into the Arab lands. When the war ended, the victorious European powers would carve up the Arab provinces according to their own interests, ignoring the promises made to Hussein and his followers. The Arab Revolt was thus a tragedy for all involved. For the Ottomans, it was a devastating blow to their legitimacy, and a drain on their limited military resources. For the Arabs, it was a moment of hope that led to decades of disappointment and foreign domination. And for the region as a whole, it was the beginning of a century of conflict over borders, identities, and loyalties that continues to this day. The revolt was one more consequence of the fatal Ottoman decision to enter World War I. That decision had not only failed to restore Ottoman power, it had destroyed the empire's ability to maintain the loyalty of its diverse populations. The multi-ethnic empire that had existed for 6 centuries was fragmenting, and there was no power on earth that could hold it together. By 1917, the Ottoman Empire was dying from within. The military disasters at Sarikamish, and on other fronts, the atrocities of the Armenian genocide, the Arab Revolt, all of these had weakened the empire's ability to wage war. But perhaps the most devastating blow was the economic and social collapse that was consuming Ottoman society from the inside. The Ottoman economy had been weak before the war began. The empire was in debt to European banks. Its trade had been disrupted by the loss of the Balkan territories, and its tax base was inadequate to support a modern military. The decision to enter World War I transformed economic weakness into complete collapse. The war cut the empire off from international trade. The Dardanelles were closed to merchant shipping. The ports of the eastern Mediterranean were blockaded by Allied warships. The traditional trade routes that had sustained the empire for centuries were severed. The flow of goods, capital, and people that had kept the Ottoman economy functioning came to a halt. At the same time, the government's need for resources to sustain the war effort grew exponentially. Hundreds of thousands of men had to be fed, clothed, armed, and paid. Horses and camels had to be requisitioned for transport. Food had to be stockpiled for the army. Factories had to be converted to war production. The government's expenses soared while its revenue plummeted. The Ottoman government's response was to print money. With no access to foreign loans and with tax collection disrupted by the war, the printing of paper currency seemed like the only solution. But the result was predictable and catastrophic. Inflation spiraled out of control. Prices doubled, then tripled, then increased tenfold. Money became worthless as the government flooded the economy with paper that had no backing in gold or silver. The impact on ordinary people was devastating. Workers found that their wages, even when they were paid, bought less and less. Farmers who were forced to sell their crops to the government at fixed prices found those prices meaningless as the cost of everything they needed to buy skyrocketed. The urban middle class, living on fixed incomes or savings, was wiped out financially. The government also requisitioned food, animals, and supplies for the army. Farmers had their crops taken, their oxen and horses confiscated, their carts and tools seized. They were left with inadequate resources to plant the next season's crops, leading to a downward spiral of declining agricultural production. The breadbasket of Anatolia, which had fed the empire for centuries, began to go hungry. The impact of food shortages was most severe in the cities. Constantinople, which depended on imported food, began to starve. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Soup kitchens opened to feed the destitute. Diseases associated with malnutrition, rickets, scurvy, beriberi began to appear. The death rate soared, particularly among children and the elderly. The situation was even worse in the provinces. Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine suffered a famine that killed hundreds of thousands of people. The causes were multiple: requisitioning of food for the army, disruption of trade, a plague of locusts, and the Allied blockade that prevented food imports. But the result was mass starvation on a scale that shocked even contemporary observers. The social fabric of the empire began to tear under the strain. Crime rates soared as desperate people turned to theft to survive. Black markets flourished, controlled by profiteers who grew rich while others starved. Corruption became endemic as government officials used their positions to enrich themselves and their families. The sense of shared sacrifice that might have sustained the war effort evaporated in the face of obvious inequality and injustice. Desertion from the army became a massive problem. Soldiers, hearing that their families were starving at home and seeing the incompetence and corruption of their commanders, simply walked away from the front. By 1917, hundreds of thousands of Ottoman soldiers had deserted, returning to their villages or hiding in the mountains. Some formed bandit gangs that preyed on the civilian population. Others simply tried to survive, growing food in hidden plots and avoiding government authorities. The Young Turk government responded to desertion with increasingly draconian measures. Deserters who were caught were hanged publicly. Villages suspected of harboring deserters were burned. Collective punishments were imposed on communities where desertion rates were high. But terror tactics only increased resentment and encouraged more desertion. The empire's infrastructure began to collapse. The railway system, already inadequate, broke down under the strain of military use and lack of maintenance. Roads deteriorated as there were no resources to repair them. Telegraph lines were cut by bandits or simply fell into disrepair. The systems that held the empire together physically began to fail. The government's administrative capacity also deteriorated. Many educated Ottomans who had staffed the bureaucracy were dead, either killed in the war or victims of disease and starvation. Those who remained were often demoralized, corrupt, or simply overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crisis. Orders from Constantinople were ignored in the provinces, not out of disloyalty, but because there was no capacity to implement them. The collapse of order was particularly severe in areas where the Armenian population had been destroyed. The Armenians had been merchants, craftsmen, and farmers who had played crucial roles in the local economies of eastern Anatolia. Their removal created economic chaos. Shops closed, markets ceased to function, trade networks collapsed. The Kurdish population that had often participated in the massacres found that they had destroyed the economic foundations of their own communities. The Young Turk leadership seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of the crisis they had created. Enver Pasha remained focused on grand military strategies that had no connection to the reality of Ottoman capabilities. Talat Pasha tried to manage the empire's administration, but was overwhelmed by the scale of the problems. Jamal Pasha ruled Syria and Palestine as his personal fiefdom, more interested in settling scores with Arab nationalists than in addressing the famine consuming his provinces. The disconnect between the leadership and the population became absolute. The Young Turk triumvirate lived in a bubble of their own making, surrounded by yes-men and insulated from the suffering of ordinary people. They continued to believe that victory was possible, that Germany would win the war and bring Ottoman triumph in its wake. They ignored or suppressed any information that contradicted their worldview. By early 1918, Ottoman society was on the verge of complete collapse. The economy was in ruins, the population was starving, the army was melting away through desertion, and the government had lost all legitimacy in the eyes of its subjects. The empire was held together only by inertia and by the fact that there was no organized alternative to the Young Turk regime. The social and economic collapse of the Ottoman Empire during World War I was as much a consequence of the decision to enter the war as any military defeat. The empire's fragile economy and primitive infrastructure simply could not sustain a modern industrial war. The Young Turk leadership, in their desperation to restore Ottoman power, had instead destroyed the foundations of Ottoman society. This internal collapse meant that even if the Ottoman army had somehow won victories on the battlefield, the empire could not have survived. The damage was too deep, the wounds too severe, the loss of legitimacy too complete. The Ottoman decision to enter World War I had not just brought military defeat, it had destroyed the state itself from within. While the Ottoman Empire was collapsing internally, its armies were being driven back on every front. By 1918, the military situation was hopeless. The promise of German victory that had lured the Ottomans into the war had proven to be an illusion. Instead, the empire faced enemies on all sides, and it lacked the resources, the manpower, and the leadership to resist them. In Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, British and Indian troops had been advancing steadily since the beginning of the war. The campaign had begun disastrously for the British. In 1916, a British force had been besieged and forced to surrender at Kut al-Amrar in one of Britain's worst defeats of the war. But the British had learned from their mistakes, improving their logistics and increasing their forces. By 1917, British forces under General Stanley Maude had captured Baghdad, the ancient capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and one of the most important cities in the Ottoman Empire. The fall of Baghdad was both strategically and symbolically devastating. It meant the loss of Mesopotamia's oil resources, which the Ottoman Empire desperately needed, and it represented the loss of a city that had been under Muslim rule for over 1,000 years. The British continued to advance north toward Mosul, capturing Ottoman positions one by one. Ottoman forces in Mesopotamia, poorly supplied and demoralized, could offer only token resistance. By the end of the war, the British controlled all of Mesopotamia, and they had no intention of returning it to Ottoman rule. In Palestine and Syria, the situation was equally dire. British forces based in Egypt had been advancing slowly but steadily through the Sinai and into Palestine. The Ottoman defences, commanded by German officers, had been strong, but they were gradually worn down by superior British resources and by the constant harassment from Arab irregular forces operating behind Ottoman lines. In December 1917, British forces under General Edmund Allenby captured Jerusalem, walking into the city on foot as a sign of respect for its religious significance. The loss of Jerusalem was another devastating blow to Ottoman prestige. The city had been under Muslim control since Saladin had captured it from the Crusaders in the 12th century. Its fall to Christian forces seemed to symbolize the empire's complete failure. Allenby's forces continued to advance north through Palestine and into Syria in 1918. Ottoman resistance, already weak, collapsed completely in September 1918 at the Battle of Megiddo. In a lightning campaign that lasted just a few days, Allenby's forces destroyed the Ottoman army in Palestine, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners and opening the road to Damascus. Arab forces led by Faisal and advised by Lawrence entered Damascus in October 1918, claiming it as the capital of an independent Arab state. Ottoman rule in Syria, which had lasted for 400 years, was over. The Arab provinces that had been the source of so much of the empire's wealth and prestige were gone, conquered by Britain and claimed by Arab nationalists. In the Caucasus, the situation was equally desperate. After the Sarikamish disaster, Russian forces had advanced deep into eastern Anatolia, capturing major cities like Erzurum and Trabzon. The Armenian population, many of whom had survived the genocide by fleeing to Russian-controlled territory, returned with Russian forces, seeking revenge against the Turks who had destroyed their communities. The Russian advance was only halted by the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, which knocked Russia out of the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 between Germany and Soviet Russia forced the Russians to return territory they had captured from the Ottomans. But this reprieve was temporary and came too late to save the empire. Ottoman forces in the Caucasus, freed from the Russian threat, advanced into the newly independent Transcaucasian republics of Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. But these advances were not strategic victories. They were the desperate lunges of a dying empire, trying to grab territory and resources even as it collapsed. The situation was made even more complicated by the presence of German forces in the Caucasus. Germany, desperate for oil resources, had sent troops to occupy Azerbaijan and its oil fields around Baku. The Ottoman and German forces, supposedly allies, found themselves in conflict over who would control these valuable territories. On every front, the pattern was the same. Ottoman forces, exhausted, demoralized, and poorly supplied, were being driven back by enemies who had superior resources and better leadership. The empire's best troops were dead, lost in the disasters of Sarikamish, Gallipoli, and countless other battles. The replacements were boys and old men, inadequately trained and equipped, led by officers who knew the war was lost. By the summer of 1918, the end was approaching rapidly. Germany, the Ottoman Empire's main ally, was clearly losing the war in Europe. The entry of the United States into the war in 1917 had tipped the balance decisively in favor of the Allies. Fresh American troops were arriving in France by the hundreds of thousands. German forces, exhausted by 4 years of war, were being pushed back toward their own borders. The Ottoman leadership finally understood that the war was lost. Bulgaria, another Central Powers ally, surrendered in September 1918, opening the way for Allied forces to advance directly toward Constantinople from the Balkans. The capital itself was now threatened, with no forces available to defend it. On October 30, 1918, the Ottoman government signed an armistice with the Allies on board a British ship anchored in the harbour of Mudros. The Armistice of Mudros effectively ended Ottoman participation in World War I. The terms were harsh, forcing the empire to demobilize its army, open the straits to Allied shipping, and allow Allied forces to occupy any Ottoman territory they deemed strategically necessary. The war was over. The Ottoman Empire had gambled everything on a German victory, and it had lost. 4 years of fighting had cost the empire perhaps 3 million dead, military and civilian combined. Entire provinces had been devastated. The economy was in ruins. The population was traumatized and starving, and the empire's enemies now had the power to dictate whatever terms they wished. The military defeat was complete. Ottoman armies had been driven from Syria, Mesopotamia, and Palestine. The empire was reduced to Anatolia and a small strip of territory around Constantinople. Allied warships controlled the straits. Allied troops were preparing to occupy Constantinople itself. The empire that had once stretched from Vienna to Yemen was gone, reduced to a defeated rump state at the mercy of its enemies. The Young Turk leadership, the men who had brought this catastrophe upon the empire, fled. Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Jamal Pasha escaped to Germany on a German submarine on the night of November 1, 1918, just hours after the armistice was signed. They left behind the wreckage of the empire they had destroyed, escaping accountability for their crimes and their failures. The military disasters of World War I were the direct consequence of the Ottoman decision to enter the war. That decision, made by desperate men seeking to reverse decades of decline, had instead accelerated the empire's destruction. The defeats on the battlefield were not just military events. They were the final proof that the empire could no longer compete with the great powers of Europe, that the Young Turks' dreams of restoration were fantasies, and that the 600-year-old Ottoman state was finished. The armistice of October 1918 did not bring peace to the Ottoman Empire. Instead, it ushered in a period of occupation, partition, and continued violence that would last for 4 more years. The Allied powers, having defeated the empire militarily, now moved to dismember it completely, carving up its territories according to their own interests and desires. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in August 1920, was intended to be the Ottoman Empire's death warrant. It reduced the empire to a small rump state in central Anatolia, stripped of all its Arab provinces, European territories, and significant portions of Anatolia itself. It was one of the harshest peace treaties ever imposed, designed to ensure that the Ottoman Empire could never again threaten European interests. Under the terms of Sèvres, the Arab provinces were divided between Britain and France as League of Nations mandates. Britain took control of Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. France took Syria and Lebanon. These mandates were supposed to be temporary, preparing the territories for eventual independence. In reality, they were barely disguised colonialism, allowing Britain and France to control the oil resources and strategic positions of the Middle East. The division of the Arab provinces was accomplished through a secret agreement that had been negotiated during the war. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, named after British diplomat Mark Sykes and French diplomat François-Georges Picot, had divided the Ottoman Arab territories into spheres of British and French influence. The agreement completely ignored the promises that had been made to Arab leaders like Hussein during the Arab Revolt. The betrayal of Arab expectations was profound. Arab leaders who had rebelled against Ottoman rule expecting independence found themselves under new foreign masters. Faisal, who had led Arab forces into Damascus and proclaimed himself King of Syria, was driven out by French forces in 1920. The British, feeling guilty about the betrayal, compensated him by making him King of Iraq, a country he had never visited and whose population had not chosen him. The partition of the Arab provinces created borders that made no sense demographically, economically, or historically. Iraq combined 3 Ottoman provinces with distinct populations: Sunni Arabs in the center, Shia Arabs in the south, and Kurds in the north. Syria and Lebanon were artificial divisions of what had been a single region. Palestine was given borders that satisfied neither its Arab majority nor the Zionist movement that sought to create a Jewish homeland there. These arbitrary borders, drawn by European diplomats who knew little and cared less about local conditions, would be sources of conflict for the next century. The instability in Iraq, the civil war in Syria, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all have their roots in the decisions made by the Allied powers as they divided up the Ottoman Empire. The Treaty of Sèvres was even harsher in its treatment of Anatolia itself. Eastern Anatolia was to become an independent Armenia, compensating the Armenian people for the genocide they had suffered. Kurdistan was to receive autonomy with the possibility of independence if the League of Nations approved. Greece was awarded substantial territories in western Anatolia, including the city of Smyrna, with its large Greek population. The Straits were to be internationalized and placed under the control of an international commission. The Ottoman army was to be limited to 50,000 men. The navy was to be reduced to a few patrol boats. The air force was to be abolished. Ottoman finances were to be controlled by an international commission. The capitulations, the system of extraterritorial rights for foreigners that had humiliated the empire for decades, were to be continued. The treaty also required the Ottoman government to hand over the Young Turk leaders for trial as war criminals, particularly for the Armenian genocide. The Allies demanded accountability for what they recognized as crimes against humanity, but Enver, Talat, and Jamal were already in exile, and the weak Ottoman government had neither the power nor the will to pursue them. The Treaty of Sèvres was a treaty designed by victors to humiliate the defeated utterly. It went far beyond what was necessary to ensure Ottoman military weakness. It was intended to erase the Ottoman Empire from the map completely, to ensure that Turkey, if it survived at all, would be a small, weak, powerless state that could never again threaten European interests. But the Allied powers made a crucial miscalculation. They assumed that the Turkish people, exhausted by years of war and defeat, would accept this partition passively. They underestimated the power of nationalism and the determination of those who were unwilling to see their homeland carved up by foreigners. As Allied forces moved to occupy the territories assigned to them under the treaty, resistance began to form. Greek forces, landing in Smyrna in May 1919 with Allied approval, were met not with the welcome they expected, but with gunfire. The Greek occupation sparked outrage throughout Anatolia, uniting Turks of all backgrounds in opposition to foreign rule. The man who would lead this resistance was Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli. Kemal had become increasingly disillusioned with the Young Turk leadership during the war, recognizing their incompetence and their responsibility for the empire's disasters. When the war ended, he refused to accept the partition of Anatolia, believing that the Turkish people had the right to rule themselves in their own homeland. In May 1919, Kemal travelled to Samsun on the Black Sea coast, officially to oversee the demobilization of Ottoman forces. Instead, he began organizing resistance to the Allied occupation. He established contact with other Turkish officers and officials who shared his determination to resist partition. Together they created a Turkish national movement that would eventually overthrow the Treaty of Sèvres and establish an independent Turkish state. The Turkish War of Independence that followed from 1919 to 1922 was brutal and complex. Turkish forces, organized by Kemal into a new national army, fought against Greek forces in western Anatolia, against Armenian forces in the east, and against French forces in the south. They also fought a civil war against Ottoman officials who remained loyal to the Sultan and who were willing to accept the Treaty of Sèvres. The war was characterized by atrocities on all sides. Greek forces advancing into Anatolia destroyed Turkish villages and drove out Turkish populations. Turkish forces responding in kind destroyed Greek villages and drove out Greek populations. The Armenian population that had survived the genocide was largely destroyed or expelled during the war. The violence of 1915 was repeated in 1920 and 1921, creating new traumas and new grievances that would poison the region for generations. But Kemal's forces ultimately prevailed. In a brilliant campaign in August 1922, the Turkish army shattered Greek forces in western Anatolia and drove them back to the sea. The Greek population of Anatolia, which had lived there for thousands of years, fled in panic, abandoning their homes and possessions in a desperate attempt to escape Turkish vengeance. The Great Fire of Smyrna in September 1922 marked the end of the Greek and Armenian presence in Anatolia. The cosmopolitan city that had been a symbol of Ottoman diversity burned for days, destroying the Greek and Armenian quarters and forcing the surviving population to flee on ships to Greece. Whether the fire was set deliberately by Turkish forces or started accidentally during the chaos remains controversial, but the result was clear: the multi-ethnic Anatolia that had existed for thousands of years was gone. By the end of 1922, Kemal's forces had driven all foreign armies from Anatolia. The Treaty of Sèvres was dead, replaced by negotiations for a new treaty that would recognize Turkish independence and sovereignty. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in July 1923, established the borders of modern Turkey and recognized it as an independent state. But the treaty also formalized one of the great tragedies of the 20th century: the forced exchange of populations between Turkey and Greece. Over 1 million Greeks were expelled from Turkey, while nearly 400,000 Turks were forced to leave Greece. It was ethnic cleansing on a massive scale, tearing families from homes they had occupied for generations and destroying communities that had existed for millennia. The Ottoman Empire was dead. In its place stood the Turkish Republic, proclaimed by Kemal in October 1923. The new state was dramatically different from the empire it replaced. It was ethnically homogeneous, abandoning the multi-ethnic character that had defined the Ottoman Empire. It was secular, rejecting the Islamic identity that had been central to Ottoman legitimacy. It was nationalist, embracing Turkish identity in a way the cosmopolitan empire never had. Kemal, who took the surname Atatürk, meaning father of the Turks, transformed Turkey with the same ruthless efficiency he had shown in the War of Independence. He abolished the caliphate, replaced Islamic law with European legal codes, banned religious orders, changed the alphabet from Arabic to Latin, and imposed Western dress codes. He was creating a new nation from the ashes of the old empire, and he was determined that this nation would be modern, Western, and purely Turkish. The transformation was impressive, but it came at a tremendous cost. The multi-ethnic, multi-religious character of the Ottoman Empire was replaced by a narrow nationalism that had no place for minorities. The Greeks were gone, expelled in the population exchange. The Armenians were gone, victims of genocide and ethnic cleansing. The Kurds who remained were denied recognition as a separate people and forced to assimilate into Turkish culture. The Ottoman dream of unity and diversity was replaced by the modern nightmare of ethnic nationalism. It was a pattern that would be repeated across all the former Ottoman territories, from the Balkans to the Middle East. The multi-ethnic empire that had generally practiced religious tolerance was replaced by nation-states that practiced ethnic cleansing and that continue to struggle with sectarian conflict to this day. The partition of the Ottoman Empire after World War I created most of the conflicts that continue to plague the Middle East. The arbitrary borders drawn by Britain and France ignored ethnic, religious, and historical realities. The broken promises to Arab nationalists created a legacy of resentment toward the West. The creation of artificial states like Iraq and Syria, without regard to their internal divisions, guaranteed decades of instability. The Palestinian problem, which continues to poison international relations today, is a direct consequence of the Ottoman collapse. British promises to both Arabs and Jews during the war created contradictory expectations that Britain could not fulfill. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, promising British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, conflicted directly with the promises made to Arab leaders during the Arab Revolt. When Britain withdrew from Palestine in 1948, it left behind two peoples claiming the same land with no mechanism to resolve their competing claims. The Kurdish question is another legacy of the Ottoman collapse. The Kurds, promised autonomy and possible independence in the Treaty of Sèvres, found themselves divided among Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran when the final borders were drawn. Denied their own state, the Kurds have been in conflict with each of their host governments for the past century, fighting for recognition and autonomy. The sectarian conflicts that tear apart Iraq and Syria today also have their roots in the Ottoman collapse. The Ottoman system, for all its flaws, had generally maintained peace among different religious communities. The nation-states that replaced the empire, however, often privileged one sect or ethnic group at the expense of others, creating resentments that exploded into violence when central authority weakened. The Treaty of Sèvres and its aftermath represent the final consequence of the Ottoman decision to enter World War I. That decision had not only destroyed the empire militarily and economically, it had also eliminated any possibility of a negotiated peace that might have preserved some form of Ottoman state. By joining the losing side in the war, the Ottomans had put themselves completely at the mercy of the victorious allies, who felt no obligation to show mercy. The partition of the Ottoman Empire created borders that would be sources of conflict for the next century. Iraq struggles with the artificial combination of Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish populations that was imposed in 1920. Syria has collapsed in civil war partly because it was never a natural political unit. Lebanon's delicate sectarian balance, designed by French administrators, has repeatedly broken down into violence, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict continues with no resolution in sight. The fate of the last great Islamic empire demonstrates how a single catastrophically bad decision can echo through generations. The Ottoman choice to enter World War I destroyed not just one empire, but created instability across an entire region that continues to this day. As we look at the wreckage left by the Ottoman Empire's collapse, the magnitude of the mistake becomes clear. The decision to enter World War I was not just a military blunder, it was a civilizational catastrophe that destroyed an empire that had endured for 6 centuries and created conflicts that continue to kill people today, more than a century later. The Young Turk leaders who made this decision were driven by desperation and delusion. They believed that one bold gamble could reverse centuries of decline, that military action could restore the empire's lost glory, that alliance with Germany would bring them victory and vindication. They were catastrophically wrong about all of it. Enver Pasha, the architect of the disaster, never accepted responsibility for what he had done. After fleeing to Germany in 1918, he spent the remaining years of his life scheming to restore Ottoman power. He traveled to Soviet Central Asia, hoping to lead a pan-Turkish movement that would unite all Turkish peoples under his leadership. He died in 1922, killed in a skirmish with Bolshevik forces in Tajikistan, still dreaming of empire, while the empire he had destroyed continued to bleed. Talat Pasha and Jamal Pasha met similar fates. Talat was assassinated in Berlin in 1921 by an Armenian genocide survivor who tracked him down to exact revenge. Jamal was killed in Tbilisi in 1922, also by Armenian assassins. The 3 men who had led the Ottoman Empire to destruction all died violent deaths in exile, unrepentant and unmourned except by a handful of followers who still believed in their failed dreams. The Ottoman Empire's fundamental mistake was believing that external action could solve internal problems. The empire's decline had been caused by institutional rigidity, economic stagnation, and its failure to adapt to the modern world. These were problems that required careful reform, patient institution building, and the development of a new relationship with the empire's diverse populations. Instead, the Young Turks chose the path of aggressive nationalism and military adventure. They believed that decisive action, bold gambles, and Turkish nationalism could reverse decline. They were wrong. Their policies accelerated the collapse they were trying to prevent. Their military adventures drained resources the empire did not have. Their genocide destroyed one of the empire's most valuable populations. Their entry into World War I guaranteed the empire's destruction. The tragic irony is that the Ottoman Empire might have survived if it had stayed neutral in World War I. The empire was weak, but it was not inevitably doomed. A policy of cautious neutrality, combined with careful internal reforms, might have allowed the empire to navigate the war years and emerge intact. The Young Turk revolutionaries in many ways represented the empire's best hope for renewal, educated men who understood the need for modernization and reform. But they made the catastrophic mistake of believing that external conquest could substitute for internal reform, that military glory could compensate for economic weakness, that nationalism could replace the multi-ethnic tolerance that had been the empire's traditional strength. In pursuing these delusions, they destroyed the state they were trying to save. The lessons of the Ottoman collapse are relevant far beyond the specific circumstances of the early 20th century. They remind us that institutions, no matter how ancient and prestigious, can be destroyed by bad decisions. They show us that desperation is a poor guide to policy, that gambling everything on one bold stroke usually leads to catastrophe. They demonstrate that there are no shortcuts to solving deep structural problems, that reform requires patience and wisdom rather than dramatic gestures. The Ottoman Empire's crucial mistake was entering World War I. But that mistake was itself the product of deeper failures. The failure to modernize earlier and more thoroughly. The failure to develop new sources of legitimacy as the old religious and dynastic bases eroded. The failure to create a sense of shared citizenship that transcended ethnic and religious differences. The failure to understand that in the modern world, economic and technological development matter more than military glory. The world we live in today is still shaped by the Ottoman Empire's collapse. The borders drawn in 1920 still define the Middle East. The conflicts created by the empire's partition still kill people every day. The resentments generated by broken promises and imposed borders still poison relations between nations and peoples. The Armenian genocide still stands as a warning of what can happen when desperate leaders seek scapegoats for their own failures. Walking through Istanbul today, you can still see the physical remnants of the Ottoman Empire. The mosques and palaces, the bazaars and caravansaries, the walls and fortifications that once protected a great power. But the empire itself is gone, destroyed by a decision made in desperation more than a century ago. The Ottoman Empire lasted for 600 years, longer than most states have existed. At its height, it was one of the greatest powers the world had ever seen, stretching across 3 continents and ruling over millions of subjects. It made enormous contributions to art, architecture, law, and administration. It created a system that allowed diverse populations to coexist relatively peacefully for centuries. But in 1914, faced with decline and desperate for renewal, its leaders made a fatal choice. They gambled everything on victory in a war they could not win. They destroyed in 4 years what had taken 6 centuries to build. They created wounds that continue to bleed today. That is the crucial mistake that destroyed the Ottoman Empire. Not the slow decline of the 19th century, not the rise of nationalism, not the military defeats that came before 1914. The crucial mistake was the deliberate choice to enter World War I, a choice made by men who believed they could restore imperial glory through one bold gamble. They lost that gamble, and we are still living with the consequences. The story of the Ottoman Empire's destruction is ultimately a cautionary tale about the dangers of desperation, the seductions of nationalist fantasies, and the terrible consequences of catastrophically bad decisions. It reminds us that empires, like all human creations, are fragile things that can be destroyed by the choices of fallible men. The thunder of the guns has long since faded. The empires that fought World War I are almost all gone now, swept away by the forces they unleashed. But the world they created, the borders they drew, the conflicts they started, all of these remain. The Ottoman Empire's crucial mistake continues to shape our world more than a century after the decision was made. And that, perhaps, is the most sobering lesson of all. Bad decisions do not just destroy the people who make them. They echo through time, creating suffering for generations yet unborn. The men who brought the Ottoman Empire into World War I died long ago, but the consequences of their mistake live on, a permanent reminder of how much damage desperate men can do when they gamble with the fate of nations. Thank you for joining me on this journey. through one of history's most catastrophic decisions. If you found this exploration meaningful, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. Until next time, remember that the choices leaders make in moments of crisis can echo through centuries, and that the difference between wisdom and catastrophe is often simply the courage to recognize when bold action will make things worse rather than better. The Ottoman Empire made its choice in 1914. The world is still paying the price.